This provides a brief background of the Landings Association's annual assessment. And when we say assessment, think of annual property owner dues. First, what is the Landings Association? The Landings Association, quite simply, is you. It's all property owners. And it's completely separate from the Landings Club with a separate board, staff, responsibilities, and budget. TLA, which is the Landings Association, provides services to all owners and maintains common property to preserve property values and amenities. And some of those are 715 acres of common property. And part of that is 91 miles of roads and 22 miles of paved community paths. One note, the Landings Association is debt-free, and that's not always common when you have a community of our age approaching our 50th birthday and the developer is no longer here. The general purpose assessment is created by the covenants. And again, think of that as your annual property owner dues. And those dues help fund the day-to-day operations and services, as well as the ongoing capital replacement of assets and infrastructure to maintain and enhance community quality, appearance, and functionality. Also, unlike other communities, all owners get to vote on annual dues, so there's not an annual dues increase if the owners don't approve it. The total amount of the annual dues is allocated between the operating fund and the restricted capital reserves fund. In 2020, the annual dues are $18.50 a lot, and that is split between the operating fund, and that covers your staffing and services, and the restricted capital reserves fund. That's for your asset replacements and repairs. So think about if you're setting money aside to replace a roof on your house, you build that fund up over time to be able to afford that. That's what our capital reserves fund is for. And once money goes into that fund, it can only be used for the repairs and replacements of capital assets. One thing to note is that although we allocate money at the beginning of the year to operations and the reserves fund, if any excess funds are left over in the operating fund, we go ahead and transfer that into the restricted capital reserves fund. The majority of the revenue comes from the annual dues, but you will see some strong other revenue streams such as commercial vehicle registration or rental income, chipping revenue, etc. And it's important to note that this other non-annual dues revenue helps hold down what the actual annual dues needs to be for the association to function, though this is the part that the association owners vote on as the annual dues. A little more than half of the operating fund expenditures are staffing for things like security and public works. Also landscaping, that's our Brightview landscape contract for about $1 million. Property and casualty insurance, repair and maintenance, utilities, other things like our information technology, lagoon, operating contingency, median center island maintenance, and the like. Now let's look at the average annual capital reserves fund expenditures over the next 5 years. You'll see we'll be spending about $1 million each year on the roads, another $750,000 each year on bridges, structures, equipment. Storm drains comes in at about $340,000 a year. Paths and trails is interesting because we have been converting the paths and trails from asphalt to concrete, which costs a little bit more money up front, but lasts a lot longer. And when sections need to be replaced of the paths, we don't have to replace entire sections. We can just replace the failed concrete panels. These next few slides show your association dollars at work, both operating and reserves. On the left, you see the crew working to clean the storm drains and using the vacuum jetter truck for that. And then on the right, you see crews working to repair a storm drain failure. For this slide, on the left, the bucket truck doing the tree trimming, thinning the canopy, and then of course on the right, you have the dump truck removing debris. So again, you're seeing crews, operations, and the equipment that they need, the reserves. The association's street resurfacing program and path replacement program are contracted and are entirely funded through the restricted capital reserve fund. Here you see contractors redecking one of the association's 11 bridges. That's a capital reserves funded project. And on the right, public works employees are working on the lagoon bank stabilization to prevent erosion and protect the lagoon structure wing wall. Those are operating budget expenses. So when was the last increase? The covenants require a community vote, like we mentioned earlier, for any increase, and you have to have at least 60% of owners voting, with 2/3 of those approving. And the last increase was $60 in 2018. We also held a vote that year. And 2/3 of eligible property owners voted, but just under 2/3 approved. 66% voted yes, and we need a 66.7% to approve the increase. So that means the annual dues have been at $18.50 for the last 3 years.